we are excited for today. So really quick, as folks are still rolling in tonight for our program, we are going to, as well, as I said, we're going to go through some organizational updates. We have a couple of policy updates for folks this evening. And we've got something planning in the works. It's going to be happening at the Capitol this month. And so we'll be talking about that and uplifting some exciting opportunities coming up this month for folks, members, organizers to participate. We'll get into some committee updates really quickly, and then we will move into the bulk of our program, where this evening we have a couple of guest speakers with us tonight, and they will be joining. I think I see one of them here right now. Her name is Dora Rose. We'll be doing introductions and things like that later. But we have a couple of guest speakers, Dora Rose from the League of Women Voters, and then we will have Brittany Stoneseffer from ACLU of Northern California joining us tonight. So they are also co-sponsors of the bill ACA 4, which you all may have heard about at our last member meeting. We unveiled our bill package for the year. And so they'll be talking a little bit about the work that they do around voting rights and with ACA 4. And then we'll just have some questions for them pertaining to voting rights and the fight for civil rights in general. So really, really exciting. We will have space towards the end for folks to ask their own questions and things like that. So definitely please be paying attention so you have your chance to ask your questions at the end, and we'll let you know when that could be. You can come off mute during that time, or feel free to drop your question in the chat, and we will be monitoring the chat and things like that, and we will uplift your question. But we definitely encourage folks to come off mute when the time comes and ask your question. And that'll be the bulk of our program. And then we'll move into our close about 7:50, do a couple of quick last minute announcements, if any, and then we will close for the evening and wrap everything up about 8 o'clock. And so it is 6:36, so I know some folks are still trickling in. So without further ado, we will just get started, and folks can still trickle in as they come in. So first off, again, just want to remind folks to stay muted, and that we are recording the call for later viewing and things like that. So even if you have to leave a little bit early, no worries. We will be, you will be able to watch the recording on our YouTube page in about a week or so. So for some organizational updates really quickly, just want to get through this as quickly as we possibly can so we have enough time for our guest speakers. So want to remind folks that our podcast, Abolition is for Everybody, is currently in season 3. And so we've had some episodes drop in the last couple of weeks. So definitely go over and check that out. It is available wherever podcasts are found, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can even listen to it over on our YouTube page. Definitely encourage folks to check that out. Also, just want to give a quick FYI that it's almost time for our summer 2023 Institute of Impacted Leaders cohort in Contra Costa County. So applications will go out sometime in next month in May. And so if you are interested in participating in the Institute of Impacted Leaders, or you know somebody who is interested in participating in the Institute of Impacted Leaders, we ask that you head over to our website and fill out our general interest form. And that you will be notified for when the Institute of Impacted Leaders applications do go live. So just a quick disclaimer for any new folks that might be in the space with us this evening. The Institute of Impacted Leaders is a 12-week training program for people who are impacted by incarceration. So that is one of the requirements for participating in the cohort, is you do have to be directly impacted. And we define directly impacted as either you yourself was formerly incarcerated, or you have a loved one, a friend, a family member, someone that you are supporting who is currently incarcerated or is formerly incarcerated. So again, we are going to be in Contra Costa County this summer. It's in Northern California near the Bay Area. So I'm super excited to bring that out there. So stay tuned for more information on that. And then also real quick, just want to let folks know that Initiate Justice will be closed at the end of the month on Friday, April 28th. So just FYI, if any emails or phone communications come through that day and you don't receive a response, it is because we are closed that day, but we will work to respond to folks when we return to the office on the following Monday. And then, so those are just some typical organizational updates. Moving into our policy updates, just to let folks know, we did have 3 of our bills heard in Assembly Public Safety Committee last month, or last week rather, on the 28th. All 3 bills passed through the Assembly Public Safety Committee. So we are super excited. Great job to everybody who supported that, maybe called in on a Me Too, or maybe you were even at the Capitol. So we really, really appreciate it. We look forward to the next steps in the process. So you can find all of our bill information on our website. But the bills that did pass Assembly Public Safety Committee are AB 1118 by Assembly Ash Kalra, and that is the Racial Justice for Act for All 3.0. And so because it is just some technical fixes and things of that nature, it doesn't need to go to appropriation. So it gets to skip the Appropriations Committee, and the next step, it will go straight to the Assembly floor. So we're super excited that it's moving along in the process. We've also had AB 1310 by Assemblymember McKinner, the Equal Chance Act that passed as well. And next steps for that bill is the Appropriations Committee, along with AB 1186 by Mia Bonta, and that is for youth restitution. And again, the next step for that bill is to go to the Appropriations Committee. So again, super excited that our bills are moving through the process. Stay tuned for more information. You can always find the information on our website, and we frequently update it whenever we get updates. So stay tuned to our website. You can also reach out to our policy team and ask your questions there as well. And so speaking of bills and policy, our co-sponsored bill ACA 4, authored by Assemblymember Bryant, the Voting Rights for All Californians, will be heard in the Elections Committee on Wednesday, April 19th. So the Free the Vote Coalition, which Initiate Justice is a part of, will be conducting lobby visits with various offices at the state capitol that afternoon after ACA 4 is heard in the committee. And so we want to mobilize as much of our community as possible and show up in person at the state capitol in Sacramento in support of this crucial bill. So there will likely be some virtual training for folks a few days prior to this hearing. So if you're new to policy, advocacy, things of that nature, no worries. So we will provide additional information as the day gets sooner. But if you are interested in attending the lobby day on April 19th, we are going to ask that you fill out this form, and I am dropping a link in the chat now. But that link is going to take you straight to our lobby day interest form. And so if you are interested and know that you can commit to coming out, we ask that you head over to that form, fill it out, and more information will follow early next week. So we do ask that you complete the form by April 10th, because that way after that, we'll go through the form and then we'll be reaching out to folks to mobilize and head to the Capitol on the 19th. So we are super excited to be mobilizing at the Capitol for this incredible bill, ACA 4, and restoring voting rights to people who are currently incarcerated and completing their sentences in prison. We know that democracy needs everyone, so we are hoping that all of you can, or most of you can attend. And if you can't attend in person, we hope that you can attend virtually and call in for Me Too's as well. So again, more information will come from that. If you have any questions around our lobby day, or anything like that, you can reach out to me at adriana@initiatejustice.org, and I will drop my email in a little bit. Or if one of my team members can also help me with dropping my email, that would be great. Awesome. So we are moving great. And so lastly, just want to do some committee updates really quickly before we move into the bulk of our program. So as folks know, or maybe if you're new to the space, we did change our committee structure this year. And so we are moving forward, and we've already had some amazing committees that were hosted, and our team members are rotating. And so every program gets a chance to host either our volunteer committee or our community action committee. So last month, our inside organizing team hosted our volunteer committee, and they were able to discuss with folks how to train inside folks to become inside organizers and what that means to organize for civil rights and for criminal justice reform and abolition from the inside out. And so they had a great discussion from what I hear, and looking to bring on more volunteers and more folks that are interested in training people inside. And additionally, that month, our policy team hosted the Community Action Committee. And so our policy director, Greg, hosted that committee where he gave a little bit more of an in-depth overview of all of our bills that we are co-sponsoring this year. And so that meeting, we also provided sort of the updated information on the committee hearing, and members were encouraged to call in for Me Too's during the public safety hearing. So that was the committee meetings last month. This month, committee hearings for volunteer committee, I will be hosting that committee. And this month, we will be walking folks through what it takes to prepare for our Institute of Impacted Leaders cohort. And so we'll be uplifting ways in which members can get involved and support the summer cohort in Contra Costa County, and explaining a little bit more about what goes on behind the scenes and how folks can support. So we know that because Institute of Impacted Leaders is specifically for people who are impacted by incarceration, but we still want to give the chance for some of our members that aren't directly impacted maybe to still support with these efforts. So I will be hosting that committee next Wednesday at 5:30 on the 12th. Really excited to bring folks in, let them know all about what goes on behind the scenes, and start reaching out to places and building up our cohort in Contra Costa County. And then our Community Action Committee will be hosted by our inside membership team, who will be sharing ways that you can support our inside members through outside outreach. So we know that inside work looks a lot different from outside work, and you have to outreach about the inside a little bit differently and a little bit more strategically. So they're going to be discussing more ways that folks can get involved and do a little bit more loud work on that end. And so we're super excited. They will be hosting that committee on Wednesday, April 26th, the fourth Wednesday of the month, from 5:30 to 6:30. So we are excited. You can head over to our website to RSVP for either one of those meetings or for both. And we hope to see you both, or we hope to see you in both meetings throughout the month, doing good work for both the inside and the outside. So that is all of our organizational updates. I spoke really, really fast, got through a lot of information. And so really just want to create some space really briefly to see if there are any questions about anything. Appreciate you, shout out to my team members for dropping the links in there for volunteer committee and the community action committee. Any questions about committees or the lobby day? Awesome. I don't see any. If anything, any questions come up, feel free to just send me an email or raise your hand, or leave that for the end and we will get to it. But now, is the lobby day a day trip? Great question, Sherry. So yes, so it would be the whole day. If you go to the form, the link on the form, it will give a little breakdown of the schedule. And so we would typically arrive at the Capitol around anywhere between 8 and 8:45 a.m. The hearing does start typically around 9 a.m. or so. And then the office visits won't start until around 1 p.m. Or after the committee hearing is finished. So it is a little bit of an all-day trip. When we do lobby days, they do tend to be long. And so if you are interested in coming, please let us know and we can provide you with additional information and a little bit of prep before so that you are fully prepared. Great question, Sherry. Thank you. Seeing no other questions, we are going to move forward and with our guest speakers. So I am excited to introduce our wonderful guest speakers. I'm really excited for y'all to hear from them as well about the wonderful, amazing work that they do. And so I am going to share my screen really quick and move to introduce our speakers for the evening. All righty, so can folks see my screen? Folks see that? Awesome, thanks, Efrain. So one of our speakers is going to be Dora Rose from the League of Women Voters. So Dora is the Deputy Director for the League of Women Voters of California, a nonpartisan organization that works to empower voters and defend democracy. Dora is the League's lobbyist, and her advocacy work focuses on driving impact through legislation and ballot measures. Her primary goals in California include closing the voter participation gap to ensure that people of color and young people have the access and tools to wield their power through voting and building a more representative democracy that better serves all of California's diverse residents. Dora has been a civil rights litigator, policy advocate, and voting rights activist for over 30 years. Her experience includes holding leadership positions as general counsel and director of voter protection for the Ohio Democratic Party with the Voting Rights Institute, the Center for Election Integrity at Cleveland State University, and as a cooperating attorney with the ACLU of California. Dora is an attorney barred in California, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. So let's give her a silent round of applause using reactions. And then our next speaker, as well our other panelist, is Brittany Stonecipher. And so I apologize, Brittany, if I pronounce your last name incorrectly. But Brittany is from the ACLU of Northern California. Brittany is an attorney working to protect voting rights for underrepresented Californians and reduce barriers to voting caused by the registration process. Since joining the ACLU in 2019, Brittany has helped lead a successful campaign to restore voting rights to Californians who are returning home after completion of a prison sentence and obtained major improvements to the California motor voter system, which registers millions of people to vote through the DMV. She also works with advocates across the state to protect voters during each statewide election. Before coming to the ACLU, Brittany advocated for criminal legal reform, including improved voting access for system-impacted Californians. Brittany received her law degree from UC Law, San Francisco, where she specialized in international human rights law. So these folks are very well prepared for the work, very experienced. They have done so much, and we are excited to have them and grateful to have them in our space. So thank you, Dora and Brittany, for being here. I'm going to actually pin both of you. Let me see if I can. There we go. So thank y'all for being here and just taking some time to attend our member meeting, share your experience, the work that you have done around voting rights, particularly for system impacted folks. Think it's just amazing, amazing work. And we're just excited to, let our members see the work and hear the work from other folks in the community. Think it's really, really important. So I'll let y'all have a couple of opening remarks if you would like, and then we will hop into these questions. So start with Dora, if you have any opening remarks that you might like to say, or thoughtful gratitudes or anything at all coming up.
I'm really, really appreciative of being in this space. Thank you for inviting me to join you. I'm a huge fan of the work that IJ and IJ Action does. I've known Taina for many years now and worked closely with her, and I'm getting to know Antoinette and Adriana, and I know Greg, and you absolutely have an extraordinary staff. So I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Pass it over to Brittany.
Thank you. I also just want to echo the thanks for inviting me to be part of this space, and my absolute gratitude and appreciation for Initiate Justice in this space. Initiate Justice, certainly compared to the League and ACLU, is a pretty young organization. So it's just constantly impressive at how much Initiate Justice is both changing the face of California in terms of policy, but also just building such a strong membership base. I was so impressed when we asked how many people generally come out to your membership meetings, and the answer was 50 to 70. I was like, that is a big turnout. Yeah, so really impressive, and thank you for letting us be part of the space.
Absolutely, absolutely. We are so excited to have y'all, and it's definitely been a pleasure getting to sort of know y'all over the last couple of weeks as we sort of coordinated this, and also just working alongside y'all in the coalition. I'm really, really excited for that as well. So thank you for being here. And without further ado, we will hop right into it. Was wondering, and the way we'll, for folks that are just now coming into the space, we're going to be going through some discussion questions, and then at the end, we'll dedicate about 10 to 15 minutes for folks if anybody has questions, but feel free to also include your questions in the chat as we go along as well. So first question, and we'll kind of just go in alphabetical order, just to make it a little bit simpler. So we'll start with Brittany, and then Dora, you can answer right after. So I was wondering, can you tell us why your prospective organizations felt it was important to co-sponsor ACA4 as opposed to only supporting it? And also how ACA4 intersects with other work that your organizations have engaged in.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So ACLU was part of the Free the Vote coalition that helped pass Proposition 17 along with Initiate Justice and League of Women Voters and several of our other partners through the ballot in 2020. And that restored voting rights for people who are on parole. So this was really always something that we talked about being the next stage of the campaign. We always said that we didn't intend to leave folks in prison behind. We were just working incrementally. So, and we've been working to implement Prop 17 with our partners ever since then, statewide and at a local level. For ACLU, we also have a long history, both in California and nationwide, of working to expand and protect voting rights for system-impacted voters, and that goes back many decades. Before Prop 17, ACLU and California had lawsuits against the past secretaries of state in order to protect voting rights for people on probation. And then after realignment passed about a decade ago, we worked to clarify that people who are in the community on post-release community supervision should be able to vote, and then that people in county jails for felonies should also be able to vote. So as the laws have changed around the criminal legal landscape, we've been fighting to say that that should expand people's right to vote as well. So we've really been using as many tools in our toolbox as possible for a long time. We also do education and outreach work to help inform folks about what their rights are and help them to exercise them. And it's important for ACLU that we do all of this work because we believe that our democracy works best when it's fair and inclusive. And as an organization whose mission is to advance the civil rights of all Californians, we know that achieving that mission requires us to look at democracy from the perspective of those who have historically been deprived of their political power, if we really want to make sure that we're representing all Californians. So given the institutional racism built into every stage of the criminal legal system, current California law that prohibits voting in prison is inherently going to have a disproportionate, and does have a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown voters. It's a racist law, full stop. So we felt that it was critical for us to sponsor instead of just supporting this because of our history on this and our institutional expertise related to that. Because it's central to our mission and because it's the right thing to do for California in terms of both strengthening our democracy and rolling back over a century's legacy of slavery.
So much, but I appreciate the historical context and just the fight that y'all have been fighting for so long. So really, really appreciate your answer. So I hope folks are soaking all of this in. We're just getting started. Dora, I'll pass it over to you.
It's funny because you're going to hear a lot of the same kind of, context, because we do a lot of our work in parallel with the ACLU. The League of Women Voters has been fighting for voting rights for 100 years now. It's actually more than 100. I think we're up to 103. We had our centennial a few years ago. And that fight is premised on the basic principle that voting is not a privilege. Instead, it is a fundamental right of citizenship. And the votes of all citizens are needed in order to make sure that we've got a representative democracy that considers everybody's perspectives, right? I mean, that's what we said 100 years ago when women in the movement were being clubbed and beaten and tortured for demanding the right to vote. because the only way that we can have a democracy, the only way, to govern ourselves by free choice is to ensure that all citizens have the opportunity to elect their representatives. And people in prison do not lose their rights as citizens. It's that simple. There may be restrictions, placed on activities related to the fact of incarceration, but we do not take away citizenship, and it makes no sense to restrict voting rights. People in prison are still subject to the laws of this country. They've still got, a stake in society, a vested interest in the political and the social issues that affect their communities. They are citizens, plain and simple. And, the League believes that it's really important to channel concerns and frustrations into constructive political power. Our whole objective is to create on-ramps to civic engagement, not to alienate people from society. And we can never forget that this is, as Brittany was indicating, this is a racial justice issue, right? Racist over-policing and mass incarceration disproportionately impacts Black, Brown, and Indigenous Californians, resulting in a really diluted voting strength and a less representative electorate. We need the voices of people who are most impacted by mass incarceration at the table and part of our civic discourse. Otherwise, we are never going to arrive at solutions to the problems that led to mass incarceration in the first place. And as Brittany was saying, this isn't new for us. We've been chipping away at this problem incrementally for a really long time. In 1974, we were proponents of Prop 10 that amended the state constitution to end lifetime disenfranchisement. In 2006, we were a plaintiff in a case holding that that imprisoned is a limited term, meaning incarcerated in a state prison, and that only those people serving time for a felony conviction in a state prison or who are on parole were eligible to vote. That's what led to people being able to vote in jails. And in 2014, we were a plaintiff in another case restoring voting rights to people sentenced under the Realignment Act that Brittany mentioned. And of course, we co-sponsored ACA 6, and we were proponents of Prop 17 that restored voting rights to people on parole. So this work is really our bread and butter at the League. And in terms, because I think you asked this also earlier, in terms of sort of how it intersects with our other work, we're nonpartisan, so we never support or oppose political parties or candidates, but we do take positions on issues, a lot of issues. We actually have a really sort of a broad portfolio of advocacy. It includes things like healthcare, education, housing and homelessness, and criminal legal reform. The list goes on. It's very extensive. And a big part of our mission is to make sure that everyone has the information and resources they need and empower people to civically engage according to their own values. We want them to vote their values. So a lot of our voter education work involves giving people the tools, the resources to do that. So that's sort of a long answer, but I hope it encapsulates why we do the work we're doing.
No, I think you both definitely hit the nail on the head, so to speak, in terms of, encapsulating like why both of your organizations, do this work, and why, and on all the intersections between, voting rights and civil rights for all people, and, how it all intersects with incarceration. So, you mentioned a couple of things, a couple of historical pieces. And so both of your organizations have a history of advocating for and around voting rights. So not just at the state level, but also at the national level as well. So I was wondering if you can share with us a little bit more about some of those national efforts and the history of voting rights, and what the voting rights work, and what, if anything, can California advocates learn from the work being done elsewhere. And we'll start again with Brittany and then move to Dora.
Thanks. So I think Dora is going to talk more about the history around felony disenfranchisement and how we got here, especially in California. And I'll talk a little bit more about what's going on in other states and the national landscape on this. So there are a wide range of felony disenfranchisement policies across the United States, ranging from no felony disenfranchisement at all, so everyone can vote whose system impacted, including folks in prison, to lifetime disenfranchisement for just a single felony conviction. But most are somewhere in between, disenfranchisement only during specific stages of a criminal sentence or a type of supervision. As Dora will explain more, majority of the states that have some felony disenfranchisement, including California, first enacted their voting bans for people with convictions during the years after the Civil War and as an explicit tool of Jim Crow voter suppression. And so most of the laws that are now getting reformed were passed either in the second half of the 1800s or the early 1900s. But over the last 2 decades or so, many of these states have started to pass reforms that are either incrementally expanding voting rights or increasing access by requiring jails or probation departments, for instance, to distribute information about voting rights or streamlining systems for getting registration to people who are system impacted. In doing so, the number of people who are disenfranchised is gradually getting smaller. We're at about 5 million nationwide right now, but just a few years ago, that was over 6 million. So the number is getting lower bit by bit. Still obviously far too many people. To zoom in a little bit more, there are 2 states, Maine and Vermont, that have no felony disenfranchisement whatsoever and never have. And in 2020, the DC abolished felony disenfranchisement for the first time, and Puerto Rico also has no felony disenfranchisement. So as I've heard Taina of Initiate Justice, I'm sure you all know Taina, mentioned before, this means that prison voting is allowed in 2 states that have the smallest populations of color and in 2 jurisdictions that have large populations of color, but that can't vote in federal elections. Coincidence? Probably not. So the movement to end felony disenfranchisement has run into some setbacks, such as the highly publicized backlash to Amendment 4 in Florida, or the recent decision by the governor of Virginia to overturn an executive order by a prior governor, which had been allowing people on parole to vote there. And those are very disappointing. But the overall trend has generally been that we're moving in the right direction on this. So several dozen state laws have been passed since the 90s to either expand voting rights or to improve voter information for system impacted people. And in just the last 5 years, 14 states, including California, have passed laws or issued executive orders that directly expand the rights of people, system impacted people to vote, which is really exciting. So it's easy for us to say this is the momentum as we're legislating, as we're talking to our elected representatives. This is clearly the way that the nation is going. ACLU affiliates in each of these states have certainly been involved. So people often don't know ACLU. There are many ACLUs. There are affiliates in each state, and then there's also a national ACLU. And we generally work in our local states or areas, and then Nationwide does national, federal jurisdiction work, and they also help the local affiliates when needed. So ACLUs have been involved in all of those reforms across the country. And national tends to get more involved when in states like Florida, where it's been complicated. Some of the big lessons in all of this work, I think, are first and foremost that these movements need to be locally based and they need to center the lived experiences of system impacted people and their families. There is no one size fits all campaign. The messaging and the types of reforms that may work in California or New York or Washington state, for instance, aren't going to be the same as the ones that are going to work in Florida or Oklahoma or Montana. So we have to think about who are the decision makers as part of that. What are the arguments that are going to be most persuasive? So for instance, in your state, does the governor have the power to restore voting rights by just issuing an executive order? If so, focus on that governor. Or do you need to go ahead and pass an entire constitutional amendment on the ballot, like was the case in California or in Florida? In that case, it's going to be a much larger campaign and you have to plan to be involved for a much longer period of time. And what arguments you're going to use are going to vary. So which does your decision maker, are they more persuaded by arguments about racial justice, about democracy and fairness, about public safety, about the budget? You kind of have to be ready to use all of those tools at different times. And of course, we're persuaded by this is the right thing to do, but sometimes, public safety and the budget are going to be the things that win the day with certain decision makers. And then related to that, both of those points, that it's important that these campaigns be both people powered. So again, organizing based and centered around people lived experiences and uplifting how this is going to have a tangible effect on people, but also data driven in the sense that if you have the means to, these should really be based on polling. So are you starting a campaign that has a good chance of winning or no? And that's not to say you shouldn't start campaigns that aren't going to pass the ballot eventually, but how you approach your decision makers and the strategies that you use and the language that you use is all going to be driven by that data if it's going to be the most effective. So for instance, for Prop 17, the ballot label, the actual language that went on the ballot that the vast majority of folks who knew anything about this saw was shaped by the campaign very intentionally based on polling and the type of language that we knew was going to be persuasive to not just the folks that are squarely in our camp, but the people who don't really think about this and don't really think that they're affected by it and are just kind of going with the flow. You want to be able to grab them immediately with a ballot label. So to sum that up, it's not one size fits all, but think about who the decision makers are and what the messages are going to be to persuade them.
Awesome. Oh, thank you so much. You gave us so much good stuff right now. I did see a question come through the chat. We're going to hold it till the end for the Q&A portion. I did flag it so I can go back to it. But just thank you so much for what you said. I'm writing down some notes and things like that. So gold, really, really appreciate it. Passing it over to you, Dora. Same question.
That was, I just learned some stuff there. Thank you, Brittany. I actually want to sort of pull back a little bit and talk about voter suppression in other contexts as well, you know, because we see voter suppression take a lot of creative forms, and certainly felony disenfranchisement is one of them. You know, we see draconian voter ID laws in other states, right? Purging voter rolls is a real problem. Limits on early voting, you know, prohibiting people from distributing water to voters in line, which was the most recent sort of evil thing that was done, I think, in Georgia. And the good news is that in California, we've gone sort of in the opposite direction. So really other states need to be learning from us and from some of the laws that we've been passing. We've made a lot of progress in recent years. We've got automated voter registration at the DMV, which has resulted in historically high voter registration rates. We've got everyone getting a ballot in the mail now. We have expanded opportunities to vote early, ways to correct mistakes if you do vote by mail and make a mistake on your envelope. We've got same-day registration and voting so that, you know, people can register and vote even after they miss the voter registration deadline at every polling location. That was actually another bill that the ACLU and the League did together. And that can happen all the way through election day, right? So all these advances that open voting up. But despite all of that, we still have a huge problem in California with a participation gap for Black and Indigenous and Latino and Asian and youth voters. That means that laws are being passed through, you know, ballot initiatives, and leaders are being elected by a very profoundly unrepresentative group. And decisions about really sort of critical issues of local and statewide importance are being made by a predominantly older white electorate. And as a historical matter, that is absolutely not an accident. We think of Jim Crow laws as being something that happened in the South, but if you look back, if you sort of go back into the Wayback Machine to 1849, when delegates were debating and drafting California's first constitution, you really see our legacy there. In that constitution, slavery was outlawed, but it's not because these drafters were abolitionists, far from it. It was at least in part for the very cynical reason that they felt that slavery gave an unfair advantage to wealthy slave owners in the labor market and the gold mines. And they wanted to even the playing field for all of the other, you know, white people who were out there in the labor market and the gold mines. A huge question actually at that time was whether African Americans should be banned from California altogether. What was never in dispute is that to be a citizen, you know, and to have voting rights, you had to be a white male. So in the late 1860s, and I think Brittany, you know, alluded to this, California refused to ratify the 15th Amendment, which prohibits voting restrictions based on race. In fact, we didn't ratify it until 1962. And in the 1860s, the state was controlled by Democrats. At the time, the party of segregation, right? The original reasons for the refusal to ratify can be found very clearly stated in Democratic State Committee resolutions from 1867. And I actually printed out this because I want to read a short passage here. It sort of sums up their thinking so well, and kind of underlines the insidiousness of this, and some of the reasons we continue to have problems today. So this is what those 1867 committee resolutions, the Democratic Committee resolutions, said. We believe it impracticable to maintain Republican institutions based upon the suffrages, meaning the voting, of Negroes, Chinese, and Indians, and that the doctrines avowed by the radical leaders of indiscriminate suffrage, meaning like the doctrines avowed by people who thought that everyone should be able to vote, of indiscriminate suffrage, regardless of race, color, or qualification, if carried into practice, would end in the degradation of the white race and the speedy destruction of the government. Okay, that is why we did not ratify the 15th Amendment in the 1860s, because they were worried about the degradation of the white race and the speedy destruction of the government. But of course, California was forced to implement the 15th Amendment after its ratification. And at that point, what did California legislators do? Well, they limited the franchise to white men wherever they could. The 1879 Constitution prohibited any native of China from voting. Most Chinese at that point were immigrants. And while those born in the US could vote, there was a series of laws that limited Chinese immigration all the way up until major reform legislation in the 1960s. And of course, it was 1911, another 41 years before women got the right to vote in California through a proposition, by the way, passed because of very cynical reasons. Men wanted women to vote along with them, and they wanted to just like shift the party structure, so they gave women the right to vote. And it was another 50 years before we got it nationally through the 19th Amendment in 1920. And even then, the vote continued to be denied to Native American women who were not extended citizenship rights until 1924, and to Black and brown women through just brutality and Jim Crow laws. And along the way, California's white male legislators instituted a whole host of laws that were tantamount to, and in some cases sort of foreshadowed, the Jim Crow Black codes in the South. Like people of color were prohibited from giving evidence in court for or against a white man. You had to be able to read the Constitution in English and write your name to vote. English only ballots served as a functional equivalent of literacy tests, right? Something that was actually only addressed when Congress adopted requirements for bilingual ballots as an expansion of the Voting Rights Act in 1975. Okay, and it's still a problem because some voting information isn't translated, and even when it is, people don't know about its availability. So to this day, we've got this problem. And of course, felony disenfranchisement, which was also embedded in that 1849 Constitution, and coupled with like persistently large racial disparities in arrest and sentencing, that's another tool that has very perniciously diluted the voting strength of communities of color. So it's really no surprise that we're still battling a participation gap, and that wealthy white people are overrepresented in the electorate. And now it's a huge priority for the League of Women Voters to shrink that gap, to make sure our government is truly representative. And that's sort of what informs a lot of the work we're doing now.
So much history, so much like I'm not like surprised, right? Because none of this is surprising, but to still hear it is just like, wow, that these things are intentionally done to keep a very specific group of people in power, and things like that. So absolutely somewhat terrifying, a little bit, right? But what kind of both of you shared, what kind of comes up for me is this understanding that civil rights issues, incarceration issues, very much interconnected, one and the same. Very much sounds like, and very truthful, that the same people that are impacted most by incarceration are also the same people that are mostly disenfranchised from voting and democracy, from what y'all are sharing. So again, such history, and yeah, we've got comments in the chat, like very eye-opening, very eye-opening to really understand how the whole, system works, not just the criminal justice system, right? The criminal legal system, but also this voting democratic system that's also at play at the same time. So definitely very eye-opening. So speaking of criminal legal work and criminal reform, civil rights and things like that, ACA 4 is, as folks who are here know, ACA 4 is about restoring the civil rights for folks that are currently incarcerated. And so unlike, other bills that Initiate Justice typically works on, this is something that's going through the Elections Committee. It's a civil rights issue, as well as an incarceration issue, but it's mainly a civil rights issue because folks are being disenfranchised. So wondering, we know that the work around this campaign, ACA 4, Restoring Voting Rights for people that are currently incarcerated, we know that that work is different and a little bit more unique than the work typically done around advocating for baseline criminal legal justice reform. And so from your experience, from both of your experiences over the years, um, advocating for suffrage and civil liberties, wondering what words of wisdom could you pass along to our members and organizers and advocates that are here tonight? Maybe some who are new to organizing around civil rights issues. So just wondering what words of wisdom or advice that you could pass along to folks listening tonight.
Yeah, and I can start with that. Thank you for the question. So I think criminal legal reform campaigns can actually provide guidance to civil rights movements that are working to specifically end felony disenfranchisement in terms of some of the core principles that I mentioned earlier. And one of those is centering impacted people. Um, in California, so as was mentioned during the introductions, before I worked for the ACLU, I worked with an organization that did exclusively criminal legal reform. One area of that was protecting voting rights for system impacted people, but it also included everything from ending indefinite solitary confinement in California to advocating for family unity for formerly incarcerated people and still incarcerated people to working to improve reentry outcomes and helping people clear their records. So kind of every stage of incarceration. And so I bring, and that was with a small organization. So I've kind of experienced both sides of this, coming from a grassroots organization to a bigger group like the ACLU, and going from working on criminal legal reform to working on voting rights specifically. And there's a lot of overlap. But I think that in my experience in California, there's a strong organizing base for the criminal legal reform work that's done here. And that comes from campaigns that have representatives from both grassroots organizations, lots of grassroots organizations often that are really locally based and that are run by impacted people or family members of people who are currently incarcerated. Um, and then by contrast, if we're thinking of like civil rights work as meaning advocacy to protect and expand free expression and to the right to participate in political decision making, that work I think has too often centered people who are already close to the center of our systems of political power, kind of working through that timeline that Dora mentioned. The right to vote has been an incremental fight, and it has only been in the last few decades that we have come to see felony disenfranchisement as a central part of the movement for suffrage. But before that, we were, focused on white women. And we were focused on white men, even before that, just white men who didn't own property. And so it has been just a little bit out from the center to the margins bit by bit. And so I think that what the movement for civil rights can learn from the movement for criminal legal reform is that we need to take our guidance from people who are directly impacted. And if we believe that decision making in a democracy should be a shared enterprise, then these campaigns should be driven by the people who are most impacted, and their voices should be uplifted as an example through that campaign of why their voices matter. And I think that the Free the Vote campaign has done a good job of bringing those strategies from both fields in. So I think it was really impactful, for instance, with Prop 17 to have people who were on parole campaigning as part of the campaign to say, this is what it would mean to me to be able to vote. And that really was very powerful for a lot of legislators to talk directly to people, because we had to deal with stupid arguments like, do people on parole even want to vote? What would they vote for? Do they even know enough about the world outside of prison to be able to make an informed vote? And so to be able to talk to someone who would be directly able to vote if this passed, I think was really impactful for a lot of legislators. And I think it gives a lot more legitimacy and coming from a just perspective and a fairness perspective to the campaign. Um, Something that's maybe a little bit different about, from my experience, voting rights work, like the field of voting rights compared to the field of criminal legal reform, is that I experienced a big shift to lots of data driven work. So I mentioned data driven stuff before, but there's just a lot of data in the voting rights world. So like how many people, how many voters this is going to affect, what districts are they in, how likely are they to turn out, so like there's just a lot of numbers in the voting rights field. So I think that experience can inform this kind of intersectional field of felony disenfranchisement reform, so that we are, like I said before, looking at polling and making sure that ideally we're constructing campaigns so that they can win, and that we know from the data that we've already developed that they can win.
Nice. Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. Dora, what
I
about
love
you?
that. I love that answer. It's dead on right that, um, that we are much more, that we have been influenced enormously, by the need to bring in impacted people and the importance of that, the value of that, the sort of genuine and organic quality that it gives to any campaign. What I had been thinking is that the work around this isn't wildly different from advocating for any sort of reform, because the process of advocacy and educating the public and challenging people's biases, regardless, of whether they're working on civil liberties or voting rights or housing issues, those processes are all the same. Your partners might be different, coalition members might be different. There's kinds of experts you tap for advice, and the sorts of biases in public education challenges might be different. But at the core, at the root, it's really very similar, because at the heart of this work is really helping people see the humanity in others. Criminal legal reform is about seeing the humanity in others. Voting rights is about seeing the humanity in others and embracing their humanity. All of our work is about that. So, people working on criminal legal reform already have a huge amount of strength to draw from to run this kind of campaign in voting rights and work on this kind of cause. And, Initiate Justice is full of leaders who have the smarts and the experience and the grit, and the humanity to lead any kind of campaign. So that's, as I was sort of mulling over that question, those were the thoughts that I had on it.
No, I really appreciate the thoughts that both of you have been able to contribute to this question, just around the differences, the nuances, but that, one can also inform the other. I also really appreciate, Brittany, your focus, on the data piece and things like that, and that big difference. And even though, we do have the data on the criminal legal side, like the emphasis of it, and how it's much more so relied upon over here on the civil rights, and the voting rights space. Really great stuff to know. I know I've got a couple of questions in my head just based on that stuff already. So before we move into our Q&A portion of the evening, really want to ask both of you again. Y'all have talked about your organizations, the work that y'all have done, the history of your organizations and the importance of it, the whys, the reasons. And so wondering if you can let us know tonight, like, how can folks here today plug in and connect to the amazing work that either or both of your organizations are doing, with the understanding also that y'all are at the national level, the state level, but also y'all have some local chapters and things like that. So how can folks get plugged into local efforts in their regions? We've got members from Northern California, Central Valley, Southern California. I know we've also had folks that have been joined us from out of state and things like that in the past. So how can folks get plugged into y'all's work, y'all's organizations, and stay connected?
Welcome, Christian. So to start with just what we've been talking about today. So for ACA 4, I know that Adriana mentioned this earlier, but please support that directly if you can. We have a template support letter that we would love to have folks submit to their legislators as we come up for hearing. We've got a fact sheet that you can use to talk to your friends and get them to support by sending a template letter of support. You can share your support on social media. We've got hashtags and content that I'm sure Initiate Justice can circulate out. You can also meet with your legislator in your district. That wasn't as much the case for the Prop 17 campaign because we were doing it during the first years of the pandemic, but we were sort of doing some in-district visits, some Zoom visits. Now in-person in-district visits are starting to happen again, but there's still some Zoom. So there's, I think, more opportunity to do different kinds of in-district visits than before. In terms of getting involved more broadly with ACLU, I'm part of ACLU of Northern California. So we're from Fresno all the way up to Oregon, and we have chapters across the state that are local. So you can sign up for a chapter to get involved. The way to do that is to just go to our website, aclunc.org, and check out the different chapters listed there, and then you can contact them directly. You can also sign up to volunteer on our ACLU NorCal volunteer page. We have a conference coming up in just a few weeks in Sacramento, our conference and lobby day. So there'll be keynote speakers and community building and networking events, as well as some lobbying visits. And then for nationwide, ACLU does something called People Power. And so that's kind of a centralized database of opportunities that you can look in your particular area about what ACLU events are happening and how you can get involved. So that includes everything from like volunteering at community events to dog birding, which is like showing up to a political event that a candidate is having and getting them on the record about a certain issue so that we can pressure them later. So I would encourage you to check out, especially if you're in other states or outside of Northern California, check out ACLU People Power and check out what's in your area.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And Dora, how can folks stay
Thank you.
connected and get
Make your
plugged in with
pitch.
League of Women Voters?
Pitch time. You can sign up for our e-news blasts on our website, lwvc.org. It's, I think, up on like the right-hand side of the website. So, and if you do that, we can keep you up to date, bring you into the loop when we have action alerts on priority policy work that we're doing. It's a great way to get involved and to plug in. Another way is to consider joining the league as a member. We've got 63 local leagues across the state who are doing grassroots work in your communities, from like, redistricting reform, which is incredibly important in terms of making sure the maps are drawn so that people actually get a voice. They do candidate debates. They help put on candidate debates. They do voter registration, lots of community education. In some spaces, they're working with the Division of Adult Parole to register folks to vote. So getting involved with the local league is a really great opportunity to plug in and engage with the league. And finally, if you're really interested in getting involved with policy work, if you're a member of the league, then we've got subject matter interest groups at the state level where you can really get involved in some of the policy analysis and discussion on the types of work we're doing. Because we are we have a very small staff of 7 people, but we really depend on our grassroots leaders who take roles as experts in their fields. So, somebody who has worked on environmental work their whole lives will head up our climate change team, for example, and do really good climate change advocacy work. So there's sort of a multi-level way of getting involved from the state to the the local leagues where you can really do hands-on work.
Oh,
lwvc.org. Should drop that in the chat.
Nice. And so I do think that we were dropping certain things and links in the chat, but yes, if you have other links that you would like to share, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Thank you so much for that. Like, folks, plug in to these amazing organizations. We are always here at Initiate Justice saying that we definitely encourage y'all to plug in with us, but we also want y'all to spread your wings and explore other types of advocacy and issue areas as well. Voting rights and things around that for not just system impacted people, but for all people everywhere, right, is such a huge issue. And so I definitely encourage y'all to plug in to League of Women Voters, as well as the ACLU, find your local chapters, get plugged in, sign up for their newsletters, and just stay connected. We, again, so appreciative of both you, Brittany and Dora, for coming and speaking with us tonight and sharing all of this wonderful, wonderful information with our members this evening and those who are watching the recording back. So we just really, really appreciate it. And so at this time, we are going to open it up for questions from our members. So folks, feel free to raise your hand or drop questions in the chat, and we will get your questions answered. So I want to go back to a couple of questions that we had in the chat early on. One question from one of our members, Sherry, and so this question says, since judges restrict rights with sentences but not end citizenship, how did this become the norm? And I think that she's referring to what you were speaking to earlier, Brittany, just about uh, just all of the normalcy of how we got to disenfranchisement for folks specifically in prison or jails and things like that.
Yeah, I think it really ties back to the racist history that Dora was talking about. Like part of what we had to answer for a few legislators when we were working on ACA 6, which then became Prop 17, because we first had to persuade 2/3 of each house of the legislature, and then we had to win on the ballot. And so we encountered all kinds of different stupid arguments, but some of them were related to like whether this actually is racist, like whether the history of this was intended to disenfranchise people of color, or is just, innocently about being concerned that people with convictions would somehow be less trustworthy to vote. And so we were combing through, committee transcripts from the late 1800s, and it says the type of stuff that Dora was talking about, where they weren't shy. They weren't trying to like pretend this wasn't racist. They were like, oh, we're not explicitly allowed to prohibit voting based on someone's race. Fine, we'll go with this proxy, and then we'll rampantly increase the policing and incarceration of communities of color, and then we'll take away civil rights based on having a conviction. There we've solved our racist math problem. So I think it became normalized because racism, white supremacy was very openly normalized. And then it's become somewhat less normal to be explicitly white supremacist. And so we've allowed ourselves, I think, as a country and as a state to pretend that this wasn't always what it was about.
Thank you. Thank you for that framing. Yeah, like, we often ask ourselves, I think, just how do we get here? Like, and why are we still here? And I think you hit the answer, like, nail on the head, like racism, pure and simple, that has just been ingrained into this country since its inception. So thank you so much for that. Dora, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that specific question, if you had any thoughts there.
No, I think Brittany summarized it perfectly. We invented laws, that were ridiculous, like, loitering, right? You loiter. What does that mean? Stand on a corner, you loiter, you get arrested for loitering, you're convicted of loitering, you can't vote. I mean, it was very, very intentional. It was not only, was there disenfranchisement, but there was the creation of laws that were going to impact some communities more than other communities, or that were, where policing around those laws were only in some communities rather than in other communities. And so it was a scheme. It was a scheme.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. We also had another question in the chat from one of our other members, Anthony. His question was, if ACA passes, if this ACA passes, ACA 4, like it passes, makes it all the way, signed, voters vote for it, all the things, will that end felony disenfranchisement in California, or is there more work to be done?
It will end officially felony disenfranchisement in California, but there is still more work to be done, because we need to make sure that people know that felony disenfranchisement is over, right? The devil's in the details, and the implementation, that is a heavy, that is a huge amount of work. So, right now, Initiate Justice and the ACLU and the League are working really hard to try to integrate voter registration into aspects of CDCR's work, the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, what CDCR stands for, and to make sure that people who are leaving on parole are actually registered to vote and will vote. That's the kind of work that one has to follow up any kind of legal change, because it takes many cycles to educate voters about the fact that they have new rights. And there's also a lot of fear right now, because there's so many complexities around, am I really eligible? Am I not eligible? Am I going to get in trouble? So we need to make sure that we normalize voter registration for people who are newly eligible, to ensure that they take advantage of the new rights that they have. So yes, formally, we're going to be removing barriers, but there's still an awful lot of work to be done.
Awesome. No, thank you. And thank you also for uplifting the fact that, that the beginning work will be over, right? But the implementation piece that we often find in this work, the most heaviest and the most difficult at times, is where the real more work will need to be done. So yes, we will definitely need more work to be done around implementation and making sure that folks know. Awesome, thank you for that. Do we have any other questions from members today in the audience? Feel free to raise your hand, come off mute, or drop something in the chat. If not, I have a couple of questions. Awesome, Anthony, go ahead, I see your hand. Go ahead and come off mute.
Oh yeah, it's not really a question, but just an observation. It's amazing the ingenuity of the people that want to suppress, in this case, voting by disfavored groups. I think a more recent example and a more general example is the rise of mass incarceration. Didn't occur in a vacuum. It kind of neatly coincided with deindustrialization. And my example of that is the city of Milwaukee, where there were a lot of skilled jobs in automotive and electronics and other fields, machinery. And when we decided to deindustrialize the United States, there was a lot of surplus labor, including a lot of the sizable Black population of Milwaukee. And I think it was a neat solution to surplus labor, particularly a lot of Black men being unemployed and competing with white men for the remaining jobs, to just get the problem solved by taking them off the streets and into prisons. And so that's, in my opinion, another example of this kind of thinking.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anthony, for that. And then Lisa, I see your hand as well. Go ahead, come off mute. What's your question?
Hi, I just want to make sure I have this straight. ACA for perfect timing. The inmates that are incarcerated will be able to vote, or is it only inmates that are paroled that will be able to vote?
That's
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Dora.
ACA 6 has already removed the restriction on people who are on paroles. People ACA 6 Prop 17 passed in 2020, and it removed the prohibition on voting for people who are on parole. So that's done, and now our job is to get those folks registered. Now we're back with ACA 4, and ACA 4 will eradicate entirely the constitutional prohibition on people who are currently incarcerated in prisons from voting, so that people in prisons, not just people on parole, will be able to vote if this passes.
Thank you for that clarification.
Great question, though. And again, I think that's just another sort of example of like the implementation phase and of all of these different, efforts and policy campaigns that we all work on, and getting the knowledge out there so that folks are fully informed on their rights that they currently have, and even on rights that they might currently be upcoming, and things like that. So definitely thank you for raising that question, Lisa, because there's a good chance that there's somebody else in this room that had the same question as you. So thank you for answering that. It's about 7:45, so I don't want to take up too much more time. But I did have an interesting or a question that I wanted to ask both of you, particularly maybe Brittany, you might be able to speak to this question because it is around the data piece. So you mentioned, the data and the data-driven, facts and figures and things like that that folks are using to sort of push various policy efforts forward around voting rights. And so wondering, how can folks with lived experience inform data collection so decision makers have the most effective data as possible?
I love this question. And like Initiate Justice is such a perfect example of this. I think that people with lived experiences are much better messengers than people who are not. I personally have not been incarcerated. I have family experience, but I'm a white lady who went to law school who was not formally incarcerated. Like, I am not always and usually going to be the best person going to talk about this, only sometimes it's like, go talk to that white guy, Brittany. But for the most part, I shouldn't be trying to collect data from other, for instance, directly impacted people, right? Like, I shouldn't be the person asking them about how this affects them because I'm not, that's not appropriate, really. So Initiate Justice has done an amazing study that was central to the Prop 17 and ACA 6 campaign in 2019-2020, called Democracy Needs Everyone. And that title came from someone who was incarcerated and who is now not incarcerated, and who said, like, that's why we need to expand voting rights, is because democracy needs everyone. Like, that's the heart of the campaign. And the study asked about 1,000 people in prison and on parole. And I imagine that some people in this group were potentially part of that survey, whether they wanted to vote, whether, what they would vote for if they could vote, and what it would mean to them. And so we were able to say, like, this percentage of people said that if they were able to vote, this would help keep them from returning to jail or prison. This percentage of people said that their top issues were public safety, jobs, education, the same things that everyone else cares about. So that story, it did a lot of things. It helped give us data to build up our arguments. It helped give us stories and quotes from directly impacted people that we were able to humanize what this would mean to people. And then I think it also did a lot to help Initiate Justice build membership and to give voice to people in a way that they were not being provided with the opportunity to speak about their political needs and desires before that. So yeah, I think being the trusted messengers and being that bridge is critical.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Dora, I don't know if you had any thoughts to the same question around how lived experience folks can inform like the data collection process.
The report is a perfect example, not just data collection, but, the testimony of people with lived experiences. There's always a question of, in committee, who's going to testify? And very often people will like, look at me or look at Brittany and say, well, you guys are the experts, we want you there. And we can provide technical expertise, but we want to do it in the background because we really want to make sure to front and center the voices of people who are impacted. the experience that they have, the stories that they've got to tell are so much more impactful and valuable and influential to legislators than, you know, the wonky technical experience that we can bring to the table. So it's not just a matter of sort of stepping back to be politically correct. We want to step back because it's more impactful and more influential to make sure that folks who are impacted step forward.
That's beautiful. And I really appreciate both of your intentions to take that step back and center, you know, folks with the lived experience, and, you know, also encourage them to take on, you know, the leadership of these efforts as well. So thank you so much. I see a hand. Ephraim, please feel free, come off mute. What's going on? What's your question?
I was like compelled to speak on this. Just for everybody here listening, you know, I came home in 2019, and it was right around the time of everybody advocating for ACA 6, which then became Prop 17 and gave people the right to vote on, the people on parole the right to vote. During that time, as we know, during the pandemic, and I was able to lobby and meet with different assembly members and senators, and share my experience, you know. And at that time, I worked for a fish distribution warehouse in which California deemed me a critical essential worker, or whatever it was that they're calling us. But yet, come November, I did not have the right to vote. And I pushed that, you know, and that was my whole thing. It's like, you say I'm one thing and I'm okay to do this, but yeah, when it comes for me to voice myself and, you know, talk about the things that I support, I'm not able to do that, you know. But you could throw me out here, put myself at risk, put my family at risk. So I think us with the lived experience, as they mentioned, you know, and then Brittany and Dora, thank you very much for the work. You know, we have to use our voices. You know, I came out here gun ho, and as you know, like right now we send in the Inside Journal, you know, with the ACA 4 letter of support. So all of us here, we encourage each other just to tell our loved ones to fill out those letters of support, because we need those. We need their voices to be heard. We need to take those to assembly members, to senators, you know, when we get to the governor's desk, you know, we need them to see that, to read that, to hear why it's important for them to vote, because we're the ones that are going to make the difference. You know, all of us here, our loved ones, the ones we're continuously fighting for, the ones I left behind, and we got to keep fighting for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ephraim. We appreciate you I appreciate you so much as a team member, as a person, as a human being, as a fellow system impacted person. And I think the words that you spoke, just super amazing and very effective and impactful in this space right now. Because I don't think anybody could have said it betterly, like that you sharing your experience and, you know, being able to share your experience is amazing, and it's beautiful. So thank you for just taking us on that journey with you. Really, really appreciate it. And yes, you are very important, Ephraim. You are important to us in this space today. So thank you so much again, both of y'all. I do not see any other questions coming through in the chat. But there has been lots of thank yous and lots of love expressed in the chat for the both of you sharing this amazing knowledge and the experience that you both carry. We just really, really appreciate it. The experience that you brought to us today is definitely invaluable. And again, I just can't tell you how grateful I am for you, both of you coming and sharing with us. And we look forward to being able to bring you back maybe for future meetings or things like that, to continue to collaborate and elevate the important work that y'all are doing around voting rights and civil rights for all people in our state. So thank you so much. With that being said, we are going to move into our close, but I really want to just give Brittany and Dora the chance to say any final thoughts before we close finally, or express anything that you'd like to the community before we close.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much again, Adriana, for hosting this and helping prepare us for this, and to Initiate Justice for welcoming us to this space, and for more broadly the work that you do for criminal legal reform, civil rights, all of it. And it is so humbling to hear people on this call and throughout the movement say that they've been affected by Prop 17. That's why we do the work. And so it's very humbling. I feel honored to be any part of this campaign. And so to be able to talk and to take up this much of y'all's time and to answer your questions as much as I can is really an honor. So thank you for having me.
Thank
I
you.
can't top that. But I feel exactly the same way. This is why we do the work that we do. It's all about the humanity. It's all about the people, all about restoring people's rights. It's all about empowering people. And, you know, it just makes us so happy to know that we've been able to help impact your lives. And, you know, you're helping impact our lives. So it's a mutual thing. And thank you.
Thank you to you both so much. And with that, again, just appreciate you. I'm like unpinning y'all so you don't have to look at yourselves like that anymore. But I know when I'm pinned, I'm like, oh, I'm right there. So thank y'all so much. We are dropping some final reminders in the chat for folks, just about following the Free the Vote campaign. So signing up for updates, all of those things. Dropping also a few reminders about upcoming meetings, the general interest form for Institute of Impacted Leaders, podcast. If you have questions about anything, our calendar, all in there in the chat. So feel free, open up those links, bookmark, save, RSVP. And again, we thank you all so much for being kind and gracious to our guests this evening. And for showing up again, as always, and being in space and being intentional and being amazing advocates and organizers and members. We really appreciate y'all. And we look forward to seeing y'all again next month. So without further ado, y'all are excused. And again, we just thank you so much and look forward to seeing y'all next month. And again, big thanks to Dora and Brittany for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.